Welcome everyone to Wednesday Night at the Lab. I'm Tom Zinnan. I work here at the UW-Madison Biotechnology Center. I also work for UW Extension Cooperative Extension, and on behalf of those folks and our other co-organizers, Wisconsin Public Television, Wisconsin Alumni Association, and the UW-Madison Science Alliance, thanks again for coming to Wednesday Night at the Lab. We do this every Wednesday night, 50 times a year. Tonight it's my pleasure to introduce to you Shannon Peters. He's a professor here in the Department of Geosciences. He was born in Lancaster, Ohio, and went to high school. Would you like to introduce you? And went to school at Fairfield Union High School there. Did his undergraduate work at Denison University in geology and biology. Got his PhD at the University of Chicago in the Department of Geophysical Sciences there. Then spent 3 years at the University of Michigan. And then 10 years ago came here to the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Tonight he gets to talk to us something that's really important for those of us who like pizza, and that's the evolution of the crust. Except for this one is the upper crust of the Earth. Biogeochemistry. It's not every day we get to have all three words together. It's impressive that you have an undergraduate degree in both geology and biology. I remember when biogeochemistry came out as a word, it was like, wow, this is amazing. Rocks, life, and reactions. If only I were younger. So I'm looking forward to hearing about this. Please join me in welcoming Professor Peters to Wednesday Night at the Lab.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for braving the elements out there today and finding the tornado shelter. Hopefully we don't have to use it, but it sounds like we're safe here this evening. So I'm going to be talking to you about the long-term view of Earth's biogeochemical evolution. And the Earth's a pretty remarkable place. It's home. We're quite familiar with it, but it's really weird. And you can see a lot of what makes it weird and distinct within our solar system in this image. We have water. That's not weird. Water's everywhere, but we have it in all three states, and you can see that here. That's pretty special. Earth is very bimodal in elevation. We have very high-standing continental crust and very low-standing oceanic crust. That's weird. We're profoundly bimodal in the elevation. That's due to tectonics. We have active plate tectonics, and that's a weird thing. And of course, we have life, which is maybe not weird, but certainly an important part of the story we're going to hear about today. And so all of these things come together in the story I'm going to tell you. And I think the best way to get a handle on why you have to understand all three of these things operating together as one evolving system, why that's so important, by asking one simple question. Well, not really simple, but a pretty straightforward question. Why is there so much molecular oxygen in Earth's atmosphere? That's one of the things that makes Earth just weird. And this is a rough composition of the Earth's atmosphere, dry atmosphere. It's about 78% nitrogen gas, about 21% oxygen, molecular oxygen, O2. Argon, and then CO2, which we spend a lot of time talking about for good reasons, is actually a trace gas. It's not very abundant in Earth's atmosphere, and we've clicked it up a little bit incrementally here. We're above 0.04 permanently now, probably, thanks to our activity. Now, just to give you a sense of how weird this is, you need to compare the present composition of the atmosphere to where the atmospheres of planets come from. And that is devolatilization of the magmas coming out of volcanoes. In this case, on Earth, they're coming out of the vents we can see active. And if you look at the composition of gases coming out of the volcanoes, it looks nothing like our atmosphere. Okay, it's mostly water and CO2. It turns out this is really variable from place to place for details of geology underneath volcanoes and so forth, but that's a pretty reasonable composition for average volcanic gas, mostly water and CO2, and a few other trace gases mixed in there. Okay, so our present atmosphere looks nothing like the source of gases to the Earth's surface environment at all. And why is there so much oxygen in the atmosphere? I think a lot of people would say, well, because life. And we have this amazing biochemistry tied up in enzyme-catalyzed reactions, ultimately sourced from the central dogma playing out to make proteins that do amazing things. And one of these proteins is rubisco here, and this one's from green alga, but that's in the chloroplasts of plants as well. And what does photosynthesis in this rubisco-catalyzed reaction do? Well, it takes the two most abundant gases in volcanic emissions, CO2 and water, mixes it with sunlight, and catalyzes this reaction to drive it towards making sugars and releasing as a byproduct molecular oxygen. Okay, so it's certainly the case that photosynthesis, the evolution of this key metabolic pathway that takes the most common gases coming out of planets, carbon dioxide and water, harnesses the most abundant energy source in the universe, probably, light from stars, and makes energy, makes sugars, and releases as a waste product molecular oxygen. Okay, so that's a necessary condition for explaining why we have so much oxygen in Earth's atmosphere. But here's the problem. I can take this reaction, and I can write it both directions. And here we are. We probably had dinner today, most of us, or maybe a beer. And we're in the process of doing this in reverse. We're breathing in the product of photosynthesis, oxygen. We're using that. There's enzymes that catalyze this reaction. You don't need to have them present. It can proceed inorganically too if you get it warm enough. That reaction's spontaneous. And it's generating energy and releasing as a gas CO2, and we're exhaling it into the room now. Okay, so this reaction we can write in both directions. You can produce oxygen, but biosphere can also consume oxygen. And that's what we do, back and forth with plants. Now, to illustrate how incredibly important photosynthesis is, but not really enough, we can do this little thought experiment here. Okay, we're in a nice little tornado shelter, as it turns out. We can seal the doors, and we can force this reaction in this direction up on the screen here. We can force this reaction, which is what we're doing right now by breathing and digesting and processing our food, and drive it this way. But let's do it for everything, except us, every cell on the planet, every living thing on Earth, all the plants, all the animals, all the biomass on Earth. Let's combust it now, seal the room, and ask the question, what happens? What happens to Earth's atmosphere? Would you be scared to unseal the room and go out into this new world? Well, let's do it. It turns out we have a reasonable estimate of the mass of life, living mass on Earth, and this is what happens. Virtually nothing. You wouldn't even notice. Now, it would be less green, and you might have trouble finding food unless you were able to synthesize it cleverly somehow, but you would live the rest of your life and not be worried about oxygen. Okay, so photosynthesis is not why you have oxygen to breathe. It's the first step. Okay, photosynthesis is necessary, but it is not sufficient to have an atmosphere like you're used to enjoying and breathing and consuming as a high-energy animal. Okay? So, what do we need to do to build up oxygen in significant quantities in Earth's atmosphere or any atmosphere? All we have to do is we have to take this reaction. We're going to assume that some sort of photosynthesis to generate as a waste product oxygen is required. Maybe you don't need Rubisco, but you need some biologically mediated process to do that. It doesn't happen spontaneously by any mechanism in significant quantities that we're aware of. Okay, so life is present. What we need to do to generate significant quantities of oxygen is make this reaction go this way, turn the Earth green, but not let it go back the other direction. To cut this process off so that it doesn't get oxidized and consumed by some animal like you and me, and we leave this behind. And where does this end up going? It goes into sedimentary rocks. And I have a few examples here afterwards. If you want to come up and look at them, you can. This is why you can breathe the atmosphere. It's life plus rocks. And it's not just any rocks, rocks that contain organic carbon. And this one, it sounds like a rock. It is a rock, but it's black. And that black comes from organic carbon compounds that are tied up in here. And this one's important. As was mentioned, I'm from Ohio. And unlike Wisconsin, Ohio's at the edge of a sedimentary basin that has a lot of this rock in it. And this particular one is called the Chattanooga Shale. It's a little south of Ohio, but there's similar rocks in Ohio of the same age, like the Marcellus Shale you've no doubt heard about. And this is a fracking target. Okay, this rock has organic carbon that was produced by photosynthesis locked in this rock, and we go down and get it. So fossil fuels are hyper-concentrated versions of this organic carbon produced by photosynthesis that's been locked in the rock record, and we're getting better and better at finding the nooks and crannies that have lower concentrations of this stuff, for better or worse. That's what we're doing, okay? So in order to produce an atmosphere like we're used to, yes, you have to have photosynthesis, but it doesn't do much by itself at all. It needs to be coupled to an ability to sequester that organic carbon into the rock record, and we need to do this in sediments through a geological mechanism. Now, if you stop for just 1 second and think about this, you should have been suspicious of the notion that, we owe our oxygen to the rainforest or something. It's not true at all. And if you think about it, it better not be true, because a lot of us drove here today, and we're going to go back outside and turn on our cars, and we're not going to have to look in the back seat and say, like, I'm sorry, Johnny, you're going to have to hold your breath. You know, we're not worried about consuming oxygen on an industrial scale out of our atmosphere, but that's exactly what we're doing. There's so much organic carbon tied up in rocks that is left behind a huge reservoir of oxygen in the surface environment, and we can see us consuming oxygen and replacing it with CO2. This is one of the most compelling lines of evidence, I think, for why humans are the reason for the CO2 increase that you can possibly imagine. You don't hear it much, but this is it. This is from Mauna Loa. These are actual measurements. This isn't like a model or something. These are measurements of the gas in little samples taken monthly in Mauna Loa going back actually way longer than this record. It's a rare, you should check it out. It's an amazing record. And this is oxygen up here, and this is CO2. And CO2 is going up. Now, this is what we talk about a lot. This has a lot of consequences for the climate. We're not going to talk about CO2 much today. But it's going up, and O2 is going down, exactly balancing that, because the going up part is us, consuming oxygen and burning fossil fuels, okay? Now, when I've shown this before, a lot of people naturally wonder what this sawtooth is, and I'll just tell you that this is a signature of the geological arrangement of continents on Earth. We are asymmetric as a planet, and even something like the distribution of landmass has a profound effect on the chemistry of the atmosphere on a seasonal basis as the biosphere blooms and breathes in CO2 and pumps out oxygen in the summer like it's doing right now, and then does the opposite in the winter. All right? Okay, so the answer to the question, why is there so much molecular oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere, is yes, photosynthesis has to happen, but it's because there's so much organic carbon that has been buried and sequestered away from the surface environment and put into sedimentary rocks. Okay, that's great. The next question then is when? When did we get this crazy atmosphere that has this incredible abundance of molecular oxygen that was pumped into it because we've buried organic carbon, basically made fossil fuels? Okay, so when did we get it? I know this is kind of hard to see just based on the colors here, but I'm going to be showing this time scale a lot, and just to get you oriented, these are billions of years ago here, and these names are time intervals that are sort of the major subdivisions, and Phanerozoic just means visible life. Okay, so this is the time when the animals are around. Proterozoic means sort of first life. We know it's actually not the first life, but that's the historical name that this time interval has, is the first life. And there's very few animals until the very end of this here. And then this says Archean, which is the earliest part of Earth history here. And actually it goes back to 4.5 billion years, but we're going to unceremoniously truncate that part of the hot early Earth. Okay, so the first part of when did Earth get its molecular oxygen? Well, life has to be part of the story, right? No oxygen in significant quantities, molecular oxygen in significant quantities until we have this metabolic pathway in place. And there's been a lot of work on this. This is a very recent paper in Science that looked at the genomes that these cyanobacteria carry around with them, and the molecular distance between the key enzymes that drive the basics of the cell record distances that tell us something about relationship, and that relationship shown here. And what these authors have tried to do is identify when oxygenic photosynthesis within this clade evolved, and that requires calibrating these distances with constraints from the fossil record for time. And when you do that and lay that on this is what it looks like approximately. Cyanobacteria and oxygenic photosynthesis within that lineage specifically is very old. Okay, this molecular estimate suggests by 2.3 billion years, 2.5 billion years, or maybe even earlier, there were cyanobacteria on Earth making molecular oxygen by photosynthesis with the same enzyme that they're doing today. Okay. Now, this is the molecular record that these cells are carrying with them today. We can turn to the fossil record to look for other evidence for this as well. And here are one of the most well-known Precambrian, that is before the Proterozoic and Archean, the pre-Phanerozoic part of the geological record. That's what I mean by Precambrian. These are stromatolites. They're actually really abundant around town here. I'll show you some. And what they are just patterns in sediment caused by microbial mats that grow. And these are modern ones. They're really rare in today's ocean for reasons that are cool, but I'll talk about briefly in a minute. You're not likely to see one today. But they stick up out of the seafloor. You know, this thing, I could break it off and hold it like this. And they stick up positive like this because they're basically cemented together with minerals. And on the top surface of this, you can see these little bubbles. These are oxygen bubbles being given off during the day by cyanobacteria colonies that are encrusting the surface. And they grow up because the cyanobacteria are trapping sediment. And it's solidifying, and they're kind of pushing their way up to keep in the light and so forth, and they kind of grow like this. Now, these fossils that we find are just patterns in rock that are very distinctive. They don't actually have cyanobacteria in them, but they are formed in a way that we think cyanobacteria were involved very clearly. And it turns out that in the old part of the rock record, even though you're never going to see them today, geologists have known for a long time that back here in the Proterozoic, that they're everywhere. And they're huge. This is a guy standing here. This is actually in the UP of Michigan. And you can see these lines here. These are giant stromatolites. They're like making reefs, basically, in the Precambrian. Okay? Now, so what's the physical? We have the molecular evidence for cyanobacteria. What's the physical evidence of having abundant stromatolites or abundant cyanobacterial communities? It's not enough to have one cell someplace evolved in the nook and cranny and one little colony is growing. In order to make a lot of oxygen, it has to be everywhere. The Earth has to be green. And so we can look at this record to get a sense of how many of these colonies are there. Are they everywhere? Are they occupying all marine environments, for example? To do that, we need to go everywhere and find a lot of stromatolites and document where and when they occur. That's hard to do, and there's not a database for this yet, but geologists love writing about these things, it turns out. And so actually this is our own Bob Dott and Charlie Byers, retired professors here in Department of Geoscience, and they're actually writing about rocks here in Wisconsin. Actually this is the Shorewood Hills Quarry. If you go around there, there's a little quarry, a lot of you nodding, you probably know the one. Go up and look for stromatolites, you'll find them there, okay? And they love writing about them, and here's a text that says the basal disc has stromatolites. And so in principle, one could just read all the published literature, not bother to go in the field and find mentions of stromatolites from all over the world and compile them. That would take a lot of time. Even for grad students, that would take a lot of time. A little side story I'm going to tell you is I'm involved with a project here on campus that I'm very excited about. It's called GeoDeep Dive. It's a horrible name. It's actually a digital library that it's a campus resource. And it's actually connected to a high-throughput computing system so that we can read millions of scientific papers and actually get information out of them. Not just find them, but get information out of them. And that's what Julia here did. She's actually a native of Madison, but didn't go to school here, but worked in the group for a summer. And she did the first analysis of all these papers, in this case more than 3.5 million papers, wrote a computer program to find stromatolites and figure out their ages based on the text. That was done here on campus. And we are able to do this in clever ways because the computers read the sentences and parse them into linguistic relationships between words and all this stuff. If you're interested, I can tell you about it later. But here's the result after doing this, for the first time quantitatively for all of the published records of stromatolites. And this is a busy graph, but it's the frequency so if every marine sediment that we have was a stromatolite, it would be 1. If none have stromatolites, it's 0. So it's normalized for how much is there. And what you're seeing here is today they're super rare. There's virtually no marine rocks that have stromatolites. But in the past, going all the way back to 2.5 billion years ago, they were everywhere. And this is a very, very conservative way to measure it. If you look at a more sensible culling, most of the Precambrian is everywhere. Stromatolites are everywhere. Okay, so all the way back to where we think cyanobacteria first appeared, these signatures of cyanobacteria communities are just everywhere on the Earth. The communities are in place. Okay, so when did Earth get this molecular rich oxygen atmosphere? Well, this key step happened, the evolution of cyanobacteria and widespread communities of them is at least 2.5 billion years old, at least. But that, as we've already seen, doesn't mean there's a lot of oxygen in the atmosphere. So we need to look at other proxies for the molecular concentration of molecular oxygen in the atmosphere. And oxygen is convenient for this purpose because when you introduce it into the environment, it just reacts with everything. I mean, that's why I'm able to be all energetic up here giving this talk, because I'm powering my body with oxygen burning. It's a very energetic reaction, and it's happy to react with many things. And so introducing oxygen to our surface environment changes not just life, it changes the physical environment radically. And there's very clear signatures of the perturbation to the geochemical system that is caused by all of a sudden having a bunch of molecular oxygen being pumped into the system. And that plays out in all kinds of records we can see in the geological record. There's a bunch of them. I'm going to go by really quickly here, but there's pyrite, fool's gold, FeS2. It's not stable today. Like if you got some pyrite and put it in a glass of water and shook it around, eventually it would dissolve, it would rust away. Okay? You're not going to find pyrite beaches in the world's oceans because there's too much oxygen around and it gets destroyed. It turns into rust and other things. But if you don't have oxygen, pyrite's very stable, and it will actually make beaches. And these are actually layers of fool's gold sand that showed up uniquely in the Earth during a little window of time when there was no significant molecular oxygen in the atmosphere at all. Now, when that world exists, there's also other things. Things like iron become soluble, much more soluble in the oceans than they are today, because oxygen grabs hold of iron and makes it rust immediately. But if oxygen is not around to do that, Fe+2 will just be available like chlorine in seawater. And there's these interesting sediments called banded iron formations that your car is quite literally derived from. This is where most of the world's economic iron deposits come from, because there was this time when molecular oxygen is bubbling into the Earth's surface environment for the first time that the Earth's oceans literally rusted. And these unique sediments show up only during this time, presumably in response to this load of iron that was mopped up by this molecular oxygen and put there forever afterwards. Okay, so, and then there's other more fancy proxies, this sulfur isotopes in the Earth. Remember, sulfur is a common volcanic gas. In the presence of oxygen and without oxygen, there's isotopes that fractionate in very different ways that show a clear signature of divide between the old record that has no molecular oxygen, in which case this fractionation is very visible, and after the time when we have molecular oxygen in the atmosphere, in which case we just lose that signature in the sulfur isotope record. So there are a variety of different proxy records that say this interval right here, this band between 2 and 2.5 is changing radically in the molecular oxygen concentration in the atmosphere. After that, we see things that tell us that there's plenty of oxygen around. That includes red beds, so soils that are red. You've probably seen them if you've paid attention. They're red because of rust in them. The oxygen latches onto iron minerals that are liberated during chemical weathering, and it rusts the soils. Those show up for the first time. Other things like gypsum, you may not think about it, but this gypsum, drywall, that's a signature of an oxidated earth. The sulfate in there is sulfur that has been oxidized, consumed molecular oxygen in the atmosphere, put it in the ocean as sulfate, and we get it back as gypsum. Okay, that shows up in the rock record very late and tells us, okay, there's a lot of oxygen in the atmosphere, enough to make gypsum. The other major record we have for the history of atmospheric oxygen, of course, is biology. Organisms care deeply about the concentration of oxygen in the atmosphere, and there's sort of three main modes of life reflected in these three time periods for which, named after life, not surprisingly, where we have a world that's dominated by prokaryotes, like cyanobacteria, and then eukaryotes. And actually, this specimen here is a little eukaryotic alga, and it's actually it's about 2.1 billion years old, and it's found just up the road in the UP of Michigan, in the Negaunee Iron Formation. But it's, big eukaryotic cells show up at about 2.1 billion years. And then there's a long period of time where not much happens, but then we get the Cambrian explosion and the wonderful fast diversification of animal life at the end of the game. Okay? Combining all of these different proxy records together, we've arrived at sort of this canonical model for the history of molecular oxygen concentration in Earth's atmosphere. Again, this is not my work, this is synthesis work from all these different sources. Now, we know there's this time when there's virtually no oxygen in the atmosphere for all those proxy records, like the mass-independent sulfur fractionation I talked about before. We know cyanobacteria weren't probably around until somewhere in this pretty long, but still, this time frame. And then we have evidence that oxygen is being produced and released in the surface environment. Now, there's a lot of interesting debate about whether or not oxygen rose really quickly here up to near modern levels, this line up at the top, and then fell. But what we do agree on is that sometime after that initial, what's called the Great Oxidation Event, where we cross this divide between no oxygen and at least some molecular oxygen, happened around here. And then there was a long period of time, most of Earth history, a good billion years or so, often called the boring billion, before oxygen rose rather precipitously into the Phanerozoic. And so one really important question is not to say, is really, why is there this long delay? Oxygen was being produced, geology was happening, the world was doing its thing. Why was this long delay between the onset of oxygenic photosynthesis and the buildup of oxygen in the atmosphere? That's really the question. Now, I've hoped I've convinced you that these things must be part of the answer, right? Rocks. There's something about the rocks. And so maybe the answer is encoded in the burial of organic carbon that's in rocks. Seems reasonable. But here's the rub. I'll cut to the chase and tell you that is correct. But it took us as geologists in a discipline, science, a while to figure this out, I think. And some people will still disagree with me, just to be clear about the record. But I'm going to make the case that we kind of missed the picture here a little bit. And this is why. This is geology in your face, right? This is the Andes Mountains. I got back from a wonderful alumni-supported field trip there with a group that's working in the Andes, and it was fantastic, in-your-face geology. And erosion is like the thing you're struck by in the Andes. Volcanism and erosion, just in your face everywhere. There's rocks. They're forming new rocks by erosion, and they're being destroyed. And geologists have looked at these things, the rock record, in a way that is traceable all the way back to this guy, Charles Darwin, who was, of course, a geologist, right? He was well known at first for being a geologist, and then secondarily became well known for his contribution to biology, which were many. And in The Origin of Species, definitely one of the most influential scientific texts ever written, he has a chapter titled, well, not very subtly, on the imperfection of the geological record. And in this chapter, he says, I look at the natural geological record as a history of the world imperfectly kept. It's written in a changing dialect. And of this history, we have just the last volume. And of the last volume, the last few chapters. And of those chapters, a few lines, and so on. And he portrays the geological record as this tattered manuscript upon which the history of life in particular, but Earth in general, was written, but then it has been ravaged by time and geology to render it not useful, ultimately in his argument, for really telling us about the history of life, mainly because he had peculiar ideas about what he thought he would expect to see in the fossil record, I guess. Now, what is good about this hypothesis is that it makes very clear predictions, and this is basically the prediction. Here's a little cartoon of it. Erosion happens, and erosion makes sediment from rocks, and those rocks, that sediment gets put back into the rock record, and this giant thing just turns, and it's slowly going away. And if we watch it over time, so nothing ever changes because it's a cycle, and if we watch it over time, there's less and less and less and less and less of a given age as we go backwards. And mathematically, this is really the prediction. That is, the amount of rock that we have at any of time t, say 500 million years ago, is a function of how much we started with times an exponential decay function, the decay curve. Okay, this is the formal prediction from Darwin's description of the geological record. It also, by the way, is wonderfully Lyellian and Huttonian, this uniformitarian view of the world where nothing changes. It's a giant cycle. Things come in, things come out, nothing goes anywhere. In fact, Hutton took it to the extreme to think that the Earth had no beginning. Everything was cyclical and so on. Now, this was a prediction, but getting the data together to test this was very difficult, and it was like what? I can do the math, I promise. 110 or 20 years before we had any attempt to actually test this hypothesis. Okay, and this is actually it, 1970 Nature paper. It's hard to see the highlights I put here, but in reading this, I love this stuff. This is a very clever thing. This was done to address the denudation of the continents, how fast the continents are going. And just for fun and completeness, this person concludes that man's intervention has increased the overall denudation rate of the land from 9 to 24 billion tons a year. In this communication, I attempt to verify this pre-human estimate and to defend its general applicability. This was motivated in 1970 to try to figure out how important humans are moving around sediment on the Earth relative to geology. I thought it was pretty cool. But this is the result over here. These are how much rock we have of given ages going back here. The details aren't important. What is important is that there were virtually no data. Getting these data together is really hard. You have to compile syntheses of geological knowledge that are difficult to assemble. You have to get a big picture view of how the upper crust is put together. It's not easy. And the only actual data for this analysis were from a Russian stratigrapher right through here, and all of this was a mishmash, okay, of extrapolation, basically. However, this fit the notion very clearly that geologists had in mind that the Earth's crust must cycle continuously and uniformly like this, and this and other analyses cemented the notion. It was a done deal. And so here is a 1976 paper, controls of atmosphere. Now, everybody knew this thing, this wheel that's turning slowly, constantly, is huge, right? It's really big, but it's turning slowly and constantly. And here's this abstract. Geochemical models of the Earth's surface environment, focusing on O2 and CO2, suggest that a dynamic, steady-state system exists. And that steady state is Nothing changes, and if it does, something else has to happen to the system. It has to be perturbed biologically or by some other forcing mechanism. The geology process by itself can't do it. So what I'm going to do is ask a really simple question. Does sediment quantity decline exponentially with increasing age or not? We kind of need to know the answer to this question, like for real. So the data set I put together to do this is called MacroStrat. I'm proud of it, but I'm not going to say much, I promise. But basically what it is a big compilation of basically what you would get if you took a cookie cutter punch through the crust and looked at the rocks and identified their type and age. That's what it is. And so these little points in the deep sea, we're going to show results from the deep sea. And this is the last time you're going to see this map. There's a bunch of them spread around the deep sea. And we're going to really focus on this North America-centric view of the world. And I don't have time to go into the reasons why I can show that this is a good proxy for the continental crust globally. It's a large enough sample that's diverse enough tectonically to be representative of crust everywhere. And I'm not the only one to have found this. But I'm going to gloss over that part going forward. So we're going to zoom into North America here and look at this a little bit more detail, just so I have a sense of where the data are coming from. Here it is. This is a little column here. This is the Exshaw column. They all have little names and stuff. But, and obviously, you can see that this is an extrapolation around control points. That part's also not important. But what is important here, I've cut off the Phanerozoic. So this is the Cambrian. The Phanerozoic portion lasts 541 million years. And the white chunks here are gaps in time. Okay, so there's no rock of this age at this column. The colors are chunks of time here that have rock. And the color of the rock is telling us what type of rock it is. Okay, at its fundamental level, this is what this database consists of. Now, the first thing I want to make abundantly clear is if you pay attention to Darwin, or if you've read about this, you'll recognize that Darwin also described the geological record not just in terms of getting worse with age, but also being gappy. And the gappiness of the rock record was of concern to him. He was absolutely right there. There's lots of gaps, and the vast majority of the time at any given place tends to be occupied by gap, okay? But music is the space between the notes, as WC said, so we're going to see why that's a signature of the process we're trying to get at. Okay, so that's what these columns look like. They're regionally composited. They include, importantly, the subsurface too, so down as deep as we know typically. That's really important. And there's a whole bunch of data acquired that are sort of linked to these like rock types and stuff that we're going to depend on later. Yes, we've made a mobile app. I'm also very proud of this. It's free, Android and iOS. You can download the thing. Wisconsin Public Radio has a nice little interview. If you want to dig it up and hear my view of what it is, I'll let you do that later. But if you turn it on, it just gives you like our best guess of what you're standing on geologically. Okay, so hopefully it'll be fun, and it gives you really good maps, and you can make observations and stuff. So check it out. And then there's an once you do that, if you make your stuff public, you can explore it around in an archive like this. It's for nerds like me, really, but if you're interested in just being out in the field and learning about rocks around you, this will help you, trust me. Check it out. Okay, so let's get to it. Ask the question, with these data, does sediment quantity decline with age or not? What I'm showing is over here is just one time slice, okay? One time slice through the stack of geology. And where there's color or solid color on this panel or color here, there's rocks of that type. The type doesn't matter for us, but there's rocks there of that age. Okay? Where there's white, there are no rocks of that age. Okay, so those are the hyatises. And so what I'm going to show you are a bunch of measurements of quantity measured in this way. The simplest way is to just simply measure the proportion of columns that have sediment, the fraction, the proportion coverage of sediment on the continent. How many columns have sediment divided by how many columns are there? Easy. Or we could measure that in square kilometers or something like that. Either one, I'll show you both. Okay? Now, before I show you the boring time series, which will put you to sleep, but I'll try not to do that, here's the little animation that shows qualitatively what we're going to do. Only from 1 billion years up to the present. Okay, and it's going by really quickly here. But I'll narrate it. So for 1 billion years, this is the start of the Phanerozoic right there. Now remember, this isn't fossils. This isn't diversity of life. This is just rock. Okay, just rock. And so you can see that something changes right about there pretty dramatically. And we're going to see evidence for that quantitatively in a second. But I'm going to be showing you time series that summarize this madness in numbers. And here it is. Okay, this is now going, so we saw that animation from here. And so that big jump was that you saw visually. And we're going to be going all the way back to 2.5 billion years typically, okay? Now, before we talk about this long period of nothing and then all of a sudden a huge increase, before we talk about that and why this looks completely different than most of Earth history from, say, 600 million years ago all the way back, we want to ask the question, is the Precambrian just bad somehow? Like, do we just not know it very well? And the answer is sort of. We can see some evidence that this is true. Now, it's a little subtle here, but bear with me. These packages of sediment in each column, okay, that we saw, those little chunks of color. And what we're doing here is measuring in the Phanerozoic in blue and in the Precambrian in red. We're measuring the duration in million years of those packages. And we can see that they're different. The Precambrian is longer in duration than the Phanerozoic. Now, the reason for this is really simple. In the Phanerozoic, we have evolution of animals happening, and we use that to tell time. We are able to see evidence for missing time in rocks that is hard to see except through the signature provided to us by evolution. And so in the Precambrian, we miss those things, and we assume that the record is more continuous than it is. And so my columns don't break out packages like they do in the Phanerozoic. And we can see that here quantitatively. However, the Precambrian is also thicker in meters. Okay, so there's more rock in a little longer chunk of time. And if we take the combination of the two, which is what was really important for today, is the rate of sedimentation, accumulation rate, meters per million years. The two distributions collapse. Okay, so take my word for it that there's no evidence that there's just something fundamentally broken about the Precambrian record here. Okay, so this signature is largely real. Okay, so let's ask the question, is this exponential? No, right? We can fit an exponential curve to this, force one, we can fit an exponential to anything. It doesn't mean it's a good description of the data, and this is a horrible description of the data, and it gives a very long half-life, but that's not important. It's just a bad description. And why is it a bad description? It's because the exponential model is predicated on this notion that once you have a package of rock, it has a one-way street out of the system, and it's, as long as that's happening approximately constantly, you'll get an exponential decline. Decline should be the signature. Actually, there's only two intervals of time that show any decline at all as a function of increasing age. Right here, decrease, and then a whole bunch of up and down, but no decrease over a long time, and then another decrease here. All of the net decrease in quantity with increasing age happens in just those two little bars, which is remarkable, and right away, not what Darwin would have expected. The rest of the time is these intervals where it's going up and down, but not going anywhere, not going up, not going down. It's a state of oscillation back and forth around some average, and that's what the record, and that's why an exponential is a horrible fit. Now, I'm going to speed up here, but everybody's heard plate tectonics. There's ocean crust, it goes away. There's continental crust, you're standing on it. And it's old because it never goes down, continental crust. Okay, so there's a huge bimodal distribution in the ocean floor, in the continents that showed up in the elevation we talked about, and it shows up tectonically in survivorship. Okay, now let's go back up onto the continents. There's some parts of the continents that are flooded with shallow seas, like off the coast of Florida. This little ramp here you can see on Google Earth is shallow water because it's on continental crust. And this big drop, boom, down to the bottom, that's oceanic crust. Okay, so some parts of the continents are flooded with seas, which means sediments accumulating in them. And some parts of the continent, like Wisconsin, are not, and sediments are going down the river. There's these different domains of sediment. We can do a better job of parsing out sediments into different domains, and that's what I'm going to show you here, because it's sensible geologically. So we're going to take that curve we saw before, and we're going to decompose it into deep sea, non-marine, which is the sediment up above sea level on continents, and marine on continents. Here's the deep sea record. This is the record of, measured in the same way, proportion of coverage, just like before, and it drops down precipitously just like we would have expected from the beginning in Darwin's point of view. And the reason for that is the seafloors are young, they're constantly being destroyed. The oldest seafloor on Earth is around there, that's still in place. Okay? If we expand this up a little bit, it fits exponential pretty well. That's a good mathematical description with oscillations that are cool, but a subject for another time. Where we have a clear signature of formation and destruction, we see a clear signature of formation and destruction of sediments, just like Darwin would have guessed. Now, how about the non-marine record? Now the non-marine record, again, is that in-your-face record. We see erosion happening all around us. Well, that's because we live above the ocean. We'd have a different perspective on the world if we were fish. But erosion is very heterogeneous on land. We have rivers at high elevation and low elevation and so on. And this is the total number, again, proportion coverage of sediments on the continents, and it drops precipitously back through time, but it sticks around forever down here. And so if we zoom in here just on the past sort of 400 million years or so, it's sort of okay exponential fit. Not very good, but not a passable exponential fit to the data. This makes sense because unlike the seafloor, which is all undergoing seafloor spreading and subduction, non-marine sediments are everything. They include glacial sediments dropped unceremoniously from Canada by ice on Wisconsin. That's slowly eroding away. That's non-marine sediment. There's a sediment in Lake Monona. It's great record, but not very long, and it won't be here forever, and so on. It's just a really heterogeneous mix of things, and you're mixing these things together and measuring one exponential fit, and that's like measuring the half-life of the atoms. It doesn't make any sense. Some stick around a very long time, some don't, some never go away. And we're mixing them together here. But still, we see a very clear signature of there's loss, because these sediments are deposited in the place where that loss is happening. How about marine sediments? So marine sediments have no such trend of decreasing quantity with increasing age. In fact, in North America, there's way more Cambrian sediment, we're standing on it, by the way, than there is of recent marine sediment. And so, obviously, an exponential fit to this does nothing. It has no explanatory power at all. So what is controlling the history of marine sedimentation on continents? The rocks of Madison, the Bascom Hall is built of marine sediment, not non-marine sediment, not deep sea sediment, marine sediment put here 500 million years ago by seas. This signature records tectonics. Okay, it records tectonics. It records this is that same in the Phanerozoic, now measured as area, rise and fall and rise and fall again, often called the M curve. This is the supercontinent breakup, coalescence, breakup, and coalescence cycle. That's the quantitative thing that's pushing the seas around on the continents. And basically, the world is going back and forth between one that looks like this, more or less like today, to one that is like this, like the rocks that Shorewood Hills Quarry were deposited in, a shallow sea that lapped all the way up to Wisconsin. And that state is changing, and that state is what's giving you these wild oscillations in the Phanerozoic. Okay? So this green part here, these changes are caused by continental flooding changes, which are caused by mostly tectonics, a little bit of climate, and that's what's driving it. And I would argue that's what's also driving this. This decline here is driven by deep sea sediment and non-marine sediment. What about this one? This is the only other decrease we have. Maybe this is caused by erosion. Well, let's go look at it. This is again the shallow marine record. That big decrease at the start of the Phanerozoic is a marine sediment signature on the continents. Let's go look at it in the field. Wisconsin's actually a reasonably good place to do it. This one's from Colorado. And this is pretty typical of this boundary right here. This is Cambrian marine sediment deposited on top of granite. Very old granite, in this case, a billion-year-old granite. The Grand Canyon has at its base a surface that John Wesley Powell called the Great Unconformity. And you can see it from the rim of the canyon. It's 1 mile of Phanerozoic sediment starting of that age right there, sitting on top of metamorphic basement rocks that are 1.7 billion years old. Okay, so this decline here in sediment quantity is not a decline at all. It's actually an increase in flooding across the continents that were once exposed and eroding. And the oceans covered them and put sediments there, and that sediment is still there to this day. Okay, so that actually records a tectonic state change across the boundary. What about this? A mystery for another time. Okay, so we have 3 different components. Deep sea sediments that have clear signature of cycling in them, just like Darwin predicted, because that's the world he described. Non-marine sediments, very close to what Darwin described, because he's walking on around on it, probably impressed by it in the Andes, just like I was. And shallow marine sediments, which have none of that signature at all. Instead, they have a process signature driven by tectonics and changes in state of the world. And it turns out that 75% of the volume of sediment we have is that stuff. Okay? So the answer to the question, does sediment quantity decline exponentially with increasing age, is no. It does not. Okay? Now this history, if you've been paying attention the whole way through and are easily pasting things together in your mind, this should look very familiar to that proxy history for atmospheric oxygen and life that we saw before. Prokaryotes, eukaryotes, metazoans. And this curve for the metazoans in the Phanerozoic this is actually what it looks like on a relative scale. The history of atmospheric oxygen in red here, the canonical history, maybe it went up to 1 or maybe not, but a long time where it didn't do anything in an abrupt rise in the Phanerozoic and then wiggles around in the Phanerozoic. In black now is the data we just saw on a logarithmic scale for the amount of sediment on continental crust. And it, at the sort of pattern level, looks very similar to the history of atmospheric oxygen. Long period of not much going on, abrupt rise, oscillations in the Phanerozoic. Now, we can do better than just say, well, look, it's similar, they're good enough, and go home. Because we can actually link this and test the hypothesis that there's a direct causal connection by calibrating a carbon burial model that is the ultimate source of oxygen in the system. And so the change in mass of oxygen in the atmosphere as a function of time is equal to the total amount of organic carbon we're bearing, the mass of it. Molar ratio, 1 to 1. 1 mole of carbon goes in, 1 mole of oxygen, molecular oxygen comes out. Now, here's the rub. That oxygen can be consumed, so there's a negative sign here, that can be consumed by organic carbon. We are doing it right now. When you go home and turn on your car, you're going to be doing this reaction part right here. And that reaction proceeds at a rate that's related to how much we have around, the amount of organic carbon that's actually in the crust. You can think of it as like the charge capacitor, how much that is, weakly dependent on the concentration of atmospheric oxygen and a constant. And then this term is really important. It turns out that oxygen reacts with everything. Well, not everything, but a lot of things in the Earth's crust itself. That's what this term is, okay? Now, the first order of business is to calibrate this FWERG, how much carbon is going into the crust and when. And to make a long story short, really quickly, this is what you need to do it. This is now the same data but turned into a volume flux. Okay, this is in cubic kilometers per million years. This is now the weight percent of organic carbon, how black the rocks are on average, basically. And this is empirically calibrated with data. I don't have time to tell you about it, but trust me, it's a good estimate for how much organic carbon is in rocks. And then this is the combination of these two to get you the burial flux, the organic carbon burial flux in moles per million years. Okay? Now here's a question for you. How much O2 has the surviving rock record, the one that we can point to and say, yep, there it is. How much is that sourced to the Earth's surface environment? So here's part of it right here, right? How much total oxygen is in that thing? It's about 35 times the present atmospheric oxygen concentration. 35, if you put that oxygen in the atmosphere right now in a bottle, 35 times that would be what the geological record is stuffed into the Earth's surface environment. The reason we don't have 35 atmospheres worth of oxygen is because rust happens. Other exit channels for oxygen, your car is doing its job right now, rusting away a little bit in the rain. Okay, so the way we do this model is we measure that. That's this thing. This decay constant, this constant we take directly from an estimate of oxidation of iron in the crust. This decay constant, or this constant we take directly from estimates of organic carbon weathering in crust, and we combine them together to make a model, forward model, calibrated by the actual record for oxygen. This is what we get. Now, for convenience sake, in gray, you can barely see it here, is the canonical model. The full model space, now there's different ways to assign carbon values and so forth. The details are of how we do that are subsumed as error envelopes around this estimate here. And so there's two different models of how to distribute TOC, and the whole model space, including some Monte Carlo simulations, is shown by this red curve here. And so this is on an absolute scale now, the fraction relative to the modern atmosphere of oxygen. And we see a whole bunch of things that look just like the empirical proxy records, including a delayed Phanerozoic rise. For the nerds in the audience, it actually turns out the Cambrian explosion happened when this first rise started to go up, but the rise in oxygen to modern levels was delayed even further. It didn't really get to modern levels until probably 10 million, into the Devonian probably. And then a big drop at the Permo-Triassic, the largest mass extinction in the Phanerozoic, right there. The other thing we see is the sustained low. This is probably the most impressive result, honestly, this transition in this long state. And we see these early possibilities of transient whiffs. Now, of course, down here it depends on if that's photosynthetic carbon or not. Okay, so the oxygenation, the timing and the magnitude of oxygenation of Earth's atmosphere, yes, it depends on biological evolution, but biology has been doing its thing forever, basically. The timing of the oxidation of Earth's atmosphere to get to a place where you could have life like us is dependent entirely on geology. It's determined by a geodynamic process that turned on and suddenly allowed the crust to store fossil fuels, basically. Now, this doesn't mean erosion. I've gone out my way to argue that erosion is not a thing. But there's clearly still erosion happening, right? No question about it. And if you were forced to come up with a model for it, that would be it. And it has a really long life. Now, I'm going to just to emphasize something here. See this little positive residual here? It's positive this whole stretch. Most of the time, it's negative, and so there's a pretty pronounced positive residual here. I'm going to re-express this axis instead of proportion coverage area. It's the same data, it's just that there's non-random distribution of areas. That's all it means. But you can see this bump gets bigger. And now we're going to fit an exponential to it here, and you can see that positive residual in the same way there. Okay? Now, this is very slow erosion, right? The half-life is 1.2 billion years. I mean, it's basically not doing anything at the Phanerozoic scale. But still, this rock is 2 billion years old. It's a couple half-lives. And so we can undo the effects of erosion mathematically, and this is what we get. And this is the moment where everything should come together, and you're like, oh, wait a second. This suggests that maybe we accumulated a Phanerozoic-like mass of organic carbon in Earth's crust for geodynamic reasons similar to this one, but then it stopped. And we lost it. Now, if we take this as our calibration for the organic carbon burial history, and we use that to predict what atmospheric oxygen would have done, it looks like this, using the same rules. And what we find, as some people have suggested based on proxy records, shockingly, that atmospheric oxygen may have gotten to near modern levels, but not stuck around. Which means it may not stick around in the future. Now, if you think about this for a second, it should be really obvious, because burying, let's say we reach this hypothetical steady state that Darwin so wants and geologists still somehow cling to. If that's the case, that means organic carbon is being buried and oxygen is being sourced, but that oxygen is being consumed by organic carbon that's being removed and weathered from the system. And so you're at steady state and there is no flux of oxygen into the atmosphere. What's being produced is consumed. And that would be fine, except for the problem of this term right here. Your car, basically. There are other exit channels for oxygen from the system. And it's not sufficient to have organic carbon buried that's produced by photosynthesis. You have to bury more of it, and more of it, and more of it, so that the mass in the crust is continuously growing. That's the only way to maintain an atmosphere that has oxygen in it. And that is definitely dependent on geodynamics. Now, within the Phanerozoic, a transient hiccup in the continent's ability to do this happened. Right here at the end of the Permian. That was the largest mass extinction in the Phanerozoic. A transient interruption. In fact, geologists have called this the coal gap. And there's all kinds of reasons for the coal gap, but it had a big impact on oxygen in the atmosphere. We got out of it because, well, you might remember the power plant over here, they used to haul in coal. When I first got here, they were still doing this and they converted it. That coal came from rocks of this age. There's a huge amount of Cretaceous and Paleogene coal, young coal, that rescued the Earth from this state. It grew the mass again. Now, this suggests that it's not sufficient to have oxygenic photosynthesis through this cool enzyme called Rubisco or something like it on another planet. It's not even sufficient to have plate tectonics. It has to be combined in a way that allows you to continually grow this mass, and an oxygen-rich atmosphere may not be permanent anywhere. So I'll end with just the main point I want you to take home from this, and that is the Darwinian view of the rock record, this incomplete, tattered manuscript, is really missing the point. It has an archive of climate, it has an archive of life, and it has an archive of tectonics in it. We can read the history of Earth through that manuscript pretty well. It turns out, however, that the formation of this manuscript is the thing that's driving the entire system. It is an active participant in the evolving Earth system. Without the sedimentary record, there is no animal life on a planet anywhere. And I'll leave you at that. Thanks.